I was at a coffee shop last Tuesday watching this guy, Mark. He was leaned so far into his laptop screen, he was practically merging with the pixels. He was frantically toggling between like 3 different spreadsheets, and his fingers were just flying. You know, the kind of intensity you see in a high-stakes thriller movie.
Right, some kind of deadline pressure, a financial analyst or something.
That's exactly what I thought. I figured, okay, desperate accountant, all-nighter before tax season. He looked exhausted, sure, but there was this strange, almost manic spark in his eyes, a genuine hunger to solve whatever this puzzle was.
So you had to ask.
I had to ask, and when I finally did, he didn't mention a deadline or a boss. He just laughed and showed me his screen.
And it wasn't a corporate audit.
It was a complex logistics map for a virtual space empire in a grand strategy game. He'd been at it for 5 hours straight.
Wow.
The irony was just, it was so striking because the day before, Mark had been venting to me about his mind-numbing data entry job, said he couldn't focus for more than 20 minutes without needing a coffee break.
But here he is, voluntarily doing the exact same mental labor.
Exactly. Crunching numbers, managing resources, meeting these self-imposed deadlines. And he was loving every second of it. The shift in his posture, I mean, from the slumped shoulders of a worker to the sharp focus of a player, it was instantaneous.
The task didn't change, but the framing did. The story he was in.
That's it. It made me realize his brain wasn't reacting to the task itself, but to the story he was telling himself about it. The spreadsheet was identical, only the stakes had changed.
And that really is the core question, isn't it?
It is. Why can the human mind find this deep down satisfaction in a digital grind, yet feel physically repelled by the same effort when it's labeled career? It suggests the line between a soul-crushing job and an addictive game isn't in what we do, but in this invisible architecture of how our brain decides to see it. Okay, so let's unpack this. We are diving deep into that very question today. We're going to explore the architecture of intrinsic motivation and the fundamental difference in how our brains process effort.
And we'll be using evolutionary psychology, neurobiology, and even some dynamic programming models to try and find that functional distinction between what we call work and what we call play.
This feels like a crucial mission.
It is. We need to move beyond just simple definitions and really understand what the human mind is fundamentally wired to seek out. These core cravings for competence, for status, for the validation of seeing visible progress. These are powerful evolutionary drivers.
And the whole point of this deep dive is to examine how modern life, especially professional structures, creates what the research calls an evolutionary mismatch.
Right. How it effectively starves those deeply ingrained biological cravings.
So we're not just complaining about bad jobs, we're analyzing a biological conflict. And to guide you through this, we've structured our deep dive around 3 core conflicts we found in the sources.
First, there's the story of ancestral mastery. This is the natural, intrinsically motivated way we acquired skills through play for millennia.
Then second, we'll look at the modern neurological hunger, that dopamine void we get from abstract bureaucratic tasks.
And finally, we'll analyze the tension between just getting resources, a job, and that vital need for status signaling, which we increasingly seem to outsource to a craft or a game.
Let's start at the very beginning of the human story, though, with play. If play feels like an indulgence or a distraction to us today, what was its original purpose?
Well, if you put on that evolutionary lens, you see pretty quickly that play is not a luxury at all. It's an adaptive practice.
Yeah.
It's an absolute imperative for survival, especially for complex, intelligent species.
Okay.
The core insight here from evolutionary psychology is actually deceptively simple. Young animals play more because they have more to learn. That correlation is just robust across the entire animal kingdom.
So a species that's programmed by rigid instinct, like a shark, it doesn't need to practice swimming.
Exactly. But a chimpanzee or a human whose survival depends on flexible, learned behavior and complex tool use
needs a lot of that early life practice.
A tremendous amount. We see this concentrated play behavior overwhelmingly in the large brain mammals who rely on that behavioral flexibility. But it's not just about how much they play. You can almost perfectly predict what they play.
Their games are rehearsals.
Perfect word for it. They are direct rehearsals of future survival requirements. Think about predatory animals, cubs, kittens. Their youth is dominated by mock chases, pouncing, stalking, all the skills they'll need to hunt for food.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the other side of that coin? The prey animals, the anti-predators, do they practice different things?
They do. In their version of chasing games, the prey animals show this disproportionate interest in being chased, rather than doing the chasing.
Ah, so they're practicing evasion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Dodging, quick changes of direction, all under low-stakes, safe conditions. This really highlights the precise, tailored nature of play. It is specialized, low-risk training designed to optimize the neural and motor pathways for adult survival skills.
That model of adaptive practice is, well, it's beautifully demonstrated in our first key example from anthropological studies of traditional societies. There's this story of a young person named Kalo in a hunter-gatherer community.
Right.
His environment demanded physical competence, precise skill, but he wasn't being forced by a chief to practice his spear throwing. Instead, he and his peers were just intrinsically motivated, laughing and competing, trying to hit a rolling target with blunted practice spears.
And Cadlo's activity, which we'd call play, was a perfect evolutionary classroom. For his developing brain, that activity delivered immediate, powerful biological rewards.
Pure dopamine.
Pure dopamine. The thrill of the chase, the immediate tactile feedback of the spear hitting the mark, and that intense social bond, the low-stakes competition with his friends.
The feedback loop is instantaneous, it's visible,
Yeah.
and it's tied directly to physical mastery.
Precisely. In that ancestral world, play provided the most efficient pathway for skill acquisition. And for two critical reasons. One, it was intrinsically motivated. Kayla wanted to do it. And two, it prepared him for survival without exposing him to immediate high mortality risks.
His brain was wired to crave this because it was the fastest route to capability.
And therefore, to survival. This makes the point so clear. Our ancestors thrived not because they were forced to work, but because they were driven to enjoy the process of becoming competent.
The idea of play as a biological imperative, not just some cultural luxury, gets even more solid when you look at the mathematical framework scientists have applied to this. This is where we get into those dynamic programming models.
Yes, from researchers like Malpress and Apinka, they didn't just observe. They actually formalized the adaptive benefits of play.
So what are dynamic programming models? In simple terms.
They're essentially tools used in math and economics to find the optimal strategy for a lifetime of behavior. You're trying to maximize long-term gains by considering the costs and benefits at every stage of an animal's life.
So they modeled a young mammal with a few choices.
Exactly. At any given moment, it has three primary choices. It can forage, it can rest, or it can play.
Okay, let's break down the variables for those choices.
Foraging costs a lot of energy, but you get an immediate energy gain. Critically, though, it carries a high risk of predation or mortality. You're exposed, you're distracted.
Makes sense.
Resting has a low cost and low risk, but obviously no gain. But play. Play is fascinating. It has a high energy cost, offers no immediate energy gain.
But, and this is the key, it carries a significantly lower mortality risk than foraging.
That's the one. You're spending calories you're not immediately replacing, but you're doing it in a safe environment.
So what was the conclusion from their model?
The core conclusion was that play, despite being immediately costly in energy, can actually be the optimal strategy during youth. But this calculation only works if the young animal has an energy buffer.
Meaning, it's being fed by its parents.
It has to be parentally provisioned.
That's the key variable, isn't it? The parents are essentially footing the bill. They're absorbing the immediate survival costs, which allows the young organism the luxury of lower stakes practice.
It's the perfect analogy. The young animal is temporarily insulated from the pressure of resource acquisition. This frees up its life currency, its time and energy, for optimal learning.
And the model showed that play is adaptive only under a couple of strict conditions, right?
Two strict conditions. One, the play activity has to demonstrably improve future adult ability, so better foraging, better anti-predator skills, or better reproductive success. And two, the mortality risk of playing has to be significantly lower than the risk of practicing that same skill in a real-life situation.
Can you walk us through one of their specific findings? Because that difference between better practice and safer practice feels really important here.
Let's look at their first model, which examined anti-predator ability. The model established that when the initial mortality risk from real-life foraging was high, let's say 6 times higher than the risk from playing in a safe area, the animal overwhelmingly chose to play.
Even if the real foraging was better practice.
Even if it offered slightly better, more accurate practice, the risk calculus still heavily favored the lower-risk training room. Survival is the absolute prerequisite for maximizing your ability later on.
You can't cash in your learned skills if you don't survive the learning process.
Precisely. And they even modeled scenarios where the benefit of play was purely social. In one model, foraging offered better social practice for later reproductive success than play did.
And even then.
Even in that scenario, the model predicted substantial play activity. The conclusion was always consistent. The reduced ability gains from playful, lower-risk practice were reliably compensated for by the drastic reduction in the risk of mortality. Play is mathematically validated as a kind of evolutionary survival insurance policy.
That idea, survival insurance, it seems to take us beyond just physical skills. It sounds like play is also critical for building emotional resilience.
Oh, it's a fundamental tool for neurological development. Play strengthens these crucial neural pathways. Specifically, it enhances the connections between the prefrontal cortex,
which is our executive function center. Planning, reasoning.
Exactly. It strengthens the connection between that and the emotion control areas deeper in the brain, the ones involved in fear and stress response. This physical strengthening is what allows an animal, and us, to effectively modulate our emotional state when we're confronted with sudden stressful situations.
So practicing physical stress in a voluntary, safe context is how the brain learns to handle real stress later on.
That's exactly what the empirical evidence suggests. Think about Belding's ground squirrels. Researchers tracked juveniles and found that the ones who engaged in more social play showed superior improvements in their coping ability when they were faced with new, frightening test arenas.
How so?
When they were put in these new environments, the highly playful squirrels showed less fear, they explored the area more readily, and they were significantly quicker at finding the hidden escape route back to safety.
So they didn't just learn motor skills, they learned confidence. They learned emotional regulation when facing the unknown.
And you can measure that resilience biologically. There's a study on young marmosets. The ones who engaged in more rough-and-tumble play displayed reduced cortisol responses over time when they were subjected to repeated stress tests.
Cortisol, the main stress hormone.
Right. And a consistent reduction in its response over time is a clear biological marker that the brain is adapting. It's learning to experience less internal distress. The physical roughhousing is actually building the neurological scaffolding you need for robust emotional stability.
It's so counterintuitive. Safe, voluntary roughhousing makes you mentally tougher. Okay, moving to the social dimension then. If play is that critical for emotional resilience, how does it factor into cooperation and group dynamics?
It's essential for establishing and maintaining social cohesion. That's a requirement for survival in any species that depends on cooperation. The animal world offers fantastic examples of play acting as a kind of social peacekeeping.
Like with female bonobos.
Exactly. They use rough-and-tumble play far more often than adult males do, and the research shows they strategically deploy it to prevent conflict in high-tension situations.
So it's a conscious effort to de-escalate. When do they use it the most?
The researchers observed that play frequency shot up during the pre-feeding period.
When tension would naturally be at its highest because of competition for food.
Precisely. The play acts as a social lubricant. It's signaling intent. This is a non-aggressive interaction. We are allies, not competitors.
It's a mechanism for reinforcing relatedness right before an event that could test that relatedness.
Exactly. And what's more, when the bonobos were confined to crowded indoor quarters, a severely stressful, competitive environment, they increased their use of play signals and non-contact forms of play. It sustained the social structure under duress. Play is saying, we are still a cooperative unit despite the pressure.
Which brings us to human culture.
It does. The scholar Johann Huizinga made this powerful argument that human culture itself, our literature, art, philosophy, even our legal systems, advances when adults have the freedom for non-essential, intrinsically motivated play.
Huizinga's insight connects all the dots. If play is the engine of innovation, then true cultural progress is rooted in that freedom to pursue competence without immediate material necessity, which perfectly sets the baseline for what our brains expect. So now let's pivot. Let's take this brain engineered for low-risk mastery, intrinsic motivation, and social cooperation, and let's force it into the hyper-specialized, highly abstract, hierarchical landscape of 21st century work.
This is the great evolutionary mismatch.
The transition is just stark.
It is. As researchers like Van Vugt and Bileby detail, for about 99% of human existence, our work operated under a hunter-gatherer baseline. Life was organized into small nomadic groups. Hierarchy was minimal. Division of labor was basic. Anthropologists often call this the original affluent society.
Affluent not in terms of stuff, but in time and autonomy.
Absolutely. Our ancestors worked surprisingly little on just getting resources. The estimates are around 20 hours a week on average.
And work was integrated, It was physical, it was social, it was often playful. You did it with people you knew.
They were generalists. Success required skill mastery across multiple domains. Tracking, crafting, social diplomacy. And the motivation was immediate. If you succeeded, you ate. If you failed, you learned a lesson that was immediately relevant.
Then came the Great Mismatch, about 10 or 12,000 years ago with the agricultural revolution.
And that shift fundamentally altered our relationship with effort. Settling down allowed for population density, which in turn necessitated specialization, complex divisions of labor, and critically formalized hierarchies. We began working significantly longer hours.
40 to 60 hours a week.
Often on tasks that became increasingly abstract and disconnected from any immediate, tangible outcome. This gave rise to the meaningless jobs and the bureaucratic silos that define so much of modern administration.
And this brings us right to the modern condition, which is symbolized by our second story, the experience of an administrator named Elena.
Right.
She works in a bustling tech hub, but her day is just defined by abstract tickets and reconciling spreadsheets.
And her experience perfectly illustrates this neurological hunger. Elena spent 3 weeks reconciling a single complex data set, high-level cognitive work, only for the entire project to be summarily shelved by a committee she's never met and whose reasoning she doesn't understand.
So unlike Kylo, whose success was a spear hitting its mark or a captured animal, Elena's kill is a digital notification that might arrive months later, or maybe never.
Her brain is performing intensive mental labor, but it is starving because the abstract, specialized, and excruciatingly slow feedback loop offers no biological reward. Her profound sense of soul tiredness isn't physical exhaustion. It's the exhaustion of a brain's reward system.
The dopaminergic system.
That's the one. It's firing constantly into a void, and it's receiving no validated signals of progress, of competence, or of purpose.
So burnout isn't just about being busy. It's the psychological toll of performing effort that has no measurable meaning to the ancient parts of our brain.
And this lack of feedback is compounded by the structure of modern work, the hierarchy. These complex, multi-layered hierarchies are psychologically stressful, precisely because they directly violate two of the brain's fundamental evolutionary needs: autonomy and relatedness.
Autonomy, which our hunter-gatherer ancestors were fiercely protective of.
Fiercely. Ancestral groups were fiercely autonomous. Leadership was based on competence. The best tracker led the tracking party. The wisest elder mediated disputes. They were persuasive figures, not bosses in the modern sense who could enforce tasks through coercive power.
You couldn't be fired from the tribe.
Exactly. If an individual disagreed with a plan, they often had the genuine option of simply not participating.
That distinction, leadership based on competence versus superiority based on coercive power, that's huge. It fundamentally changes the social contract.
And it explains the incredible stress we feel from workplace criticism today. When a manager critiques an employee's work, that criticism is often taken so personally, so defensively.
Why is that?
Because ancestrally, there was no conceptual separation between the role of a manager and the person delivering the criticism. The feedback lands, evolutionarily speaking, as a direct challenge to your status and competence within the tribe, not just as detached feedback on a quarterly report. The constant presence of this hierarchy, the persistent loss of self-direction, constantly triggers stress responses designed for threat, not for office life.
So we are essentially working a 40 to 60-hour week in this highly specialized, anonymous, hierarchical environment that is just fundamentally misaligned with the 50,000-year-old software running in our heads.
And that leads directly to the neurobiological mechanism that El Panetti termed the dopaminergic mismatch. We should probably talk about the mesocortical limbic dopaminergic system in more detail.
That's the primary system for wanting, for drive, the engine of exploration.
It is. It's the neural infrastructure that evolved to motivate exploration, planning, goal setting, long-term foresight. It makes us intensely interested in navigating and mastering our environment to acquire resources. But in modern affluent societies, this system faces two big problems.
It's either starved
by the abstract nature of work, which is Elena's problem, or it's constantly being misaligned and overstimulated by easily accessible, high-reward, fast feedback stimuli.
Like high-calorie processed foods or the digital games Mark was immersed in.
Precisely. These modern creations, the digital world in particular, are incredibly effective at exploiting our evolved systems. They offer immediate, fast, and often trivial dopamine hits. They effectively hijack the system that was designed to motivate us to cross a dangerous savanna or plan a difficult hunt.
So the brain gets the reward signal, but it's disconnected from real-world progress.
Exactly. This mismatch between our normal physiology and our current conditions, where we're just bombarded with these easy rewards, is a key hypothesis for the increased prevalence of some mental disorders. The brain is constantly running, but it's getting nowhere meaningful.
It's the tragedy of the explorer who finally found paradise, only to realize the engine of his motivation is now turning on itself. So if our official economy is failing to feed this essential drive for competence and status, where are people redirecting all that massive energy?
We redirect it into play. But adult play has a specific function that goes beyond mere practice. And this brings us to our third theme: play, status, and the digital arena.
Okay.
While we establish that juvenile play is crucial for natural selection, practice for survival adult play often becomes a stage for sexual selection and status signaling.
So the stakes shift. It's not about mastering a skill for survival anymore. It's about demonstrating desirable traits to attract mates and establish social standing.
Exactly. Researchers like Moraz and colleagues developed what they call the signal theory of playfulness. The theory argues that engaging in non-essential playful activity, which is inherently costly in time and energy, serves as a reliable, honest signal of a healthy physical and psychological condition.
So the logic is, if I can afford to spend hours playing a game or mastering a craft, I must be healthy and competent enough that I've already covered my basic survival needs.
That's the evolutionary logic. And the type of trait being signaled can differ slightly. For males, playfulness often signals non-aggressiveness, competence, reliability traits for a good long-term partner. For females, playfulness often signals youthfulness and accessibility. Since play is voluntary and energy-intensive, it's hard to fake.
And does the research actually support this in modern contexts?
It does. Studies have shown a positive correlation between high levels of perceived playfulness and the number of both long-term and short-term partners in both men and women. In essence, playfulness is being sexually selected because playful adults are seen as healthier, more adaptable, and safer social partners.
This phenomenon of signaling extreme competence through non-essential craft is perfectly illustrated by the third individual we wanted to highlight, Eris, the woodcarver.
Yes.
He lives in a community where status isn't just about how much you have, but about visible, demonstrated skill.
Eris spends countless hours on these intricate, aesthetically brilliant wood carvings. These pieces are functionally unnecessary. They don't help him gather more food or build a better shelter. They are pure status signaling through play. A public demonstration of extreme, specialized competence that requires patience and mastery.
He's establishing himself as the most skilled, which enhances his social standing and makes him a more attractive partner.
Right. But his story highlights the tension. When a high-paying manufacturing plant opens nearby, offering repetitive assembly line work, Eris takes the job.
He's acquiring resources to survive and provide, but he loses the competence-based play that defined his social identity.
And that is the core conflict of the modern economy, the divorce between resource acquisition and status signaling. His factory job provides immediate survival, the necessary resources, but his craft provided the deep satisfaction of competence and the validation of social identity. He traded the play of mastery for the work of provision.
And his internal motivation system, like Elena's, starts to wither.
It's no wonder, then, that so many people redirect this starved drive for status into highly competitive digital arenas. Which brings us right back to Mark and his virtual space empire.
Gaming has become the preeminent modern arena for status competition.
Without a doubt. Researchers like Michael Kasumovich confirm that adult play, especially complex strategy and violent gaming, is heavily driven by the search for status. It's a reliable, measurable way to test your skill against your peers and establish a virtual hierarchy.
Why are competitive games so good at satisfying this status drive?
Because the game designers have, perhaps unintentionally, created an ideal evolutionary testing ground. Think of popular competitive games like Fortnite or Valorant. They strive for a flat playing field.
Right, you can buy cosmetic upgrades, but not functional advantages.
Exactly. Any advantages must be earned equally within the match. This means that winning or losing is perceived by the brain as a highly reliable, quantifiable measure of an individual's actual competence and status relative to the opposition.
It's the ultimate social experiment under lab conditions, a meritocracy with instant feedback.
And this taps into a neurobiological concept known as the winner-loser effect. In many species, winning a contest actually increases your likelihood of future success, partly through physiological changes. In humans, while hormones are relevant, the effect is strongly driven by self-perception.
What do you mean?
If a player loses, but they perceived the loss was due to some external, unfair variable like a pay-to-win mechanic. The impact on their self-perceived competence is minimal. But if you lose repeatedly on that flat playing field, the loss negatively impacts your self-perception of ability, status, and desirability. The virtual loss feels like a real status demotion.
The brain struggles to tell the difference between the virtual contest and a real one. It's that hijacking of the dopaminergic system again. But this digital status arena must introduce some complex social dynamics that reflect our deeper, evolved competitive history.
Oh, absolutely. The competitive arena, when it blurs the line between a skill contest and an evolved status contest, brings latent social conflicts right to the surface. The fascinating yet troubling Halo study is a clear illustration of this.
Walk us through the findings of that study. It feels critical for understanding this modern challenge to status.
So researchers observed male players interacting with a teammate whose voice was manipulated to sound either male or female. The finding was remarkably specific.
What was it?
Men who performed worse than the female voice character were significantly more aggressive and used a higher frequency of sexist slurs and derogatory language against her compared to men who either outperformed her or who played against a male voice.
So if a high-status male is clearly better than the female player, the aggression is low. He's already high status, so there's no threat. But if a lower status male is outperformed by a woman, what's the evolutionary trigger for that hostility?
The analysis points toward the preservation of an evolved male-only status hierarchy. Historically, status competition was largely intrasexual men, competing with men for resources and mates, and women with women. But in the modern context, where education, employment, and social standing are based on generalized competence, regardless of sex, men and women compete directly for the same status markers.
And the virtual arena is one of a few places where this performance is measured instantly and undeniably.
So when a low-status man is outperformed by a woman in this novel, flattened playing field, it directly threatens his evolved social standing and potential mating access. The aggression they observed is interpreted as an evolved tactic, not necessarily conscious, used by lower status individuals to discourage the outperforming party, in this case a woman, from competing in that hierarchy.
So they can preserve their relative position, a primitive response to a modern context.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've established a pretty comprehensive diagnosis here. Our brains crave competence, autonomy, and status feedback, yet the modern workplace starves this system. And that pushes that drive into high-feedback, competitive digital arenas that sometimes trigger these aggressive, primitive responses when status is challenged.
That's a great summary.
So now we have to turn to the solution. How do we redesign the invisible architecture of work to give us what we biologically crave without turning every day into some cynical, point-chasing, gamified environment?
We have to shift the motivation. We have to go from the external pressure, the I have to do this or I'll be punished, to the internal narrative, the feeling that I get to do this and I see the value.
Which means we need to align the work experience with that core psychology we discussed earlier. The mind primarily files activities under these internal stories. Am I choosing this? Does this contribute to my mastery? Is my effort visible?
Precisely. This is the application of what's called self-determination theory. Intrinsic motivation, the kind that drives voluntary addictive play, is fueled by three components: a feeling of autonomy, which is choice and ownership; competence, seeing measurable progress and mastery; and relatedness, so social connection and purpose.
And games are exceptional at delivering all three.
While the traditional bureaucratic structure excels at blocking all three.
Let's talk about that common pitfall, gamification. We're not talking about just adding points and badges, are we? Because that's usually where it fails.
No, absolutely not. The sources show us both the power and the peril of gamification. It's a tool, not a solution. It works powerfully when the game mechanics are tightly connected to real-world outcomes and team identity.
Can you give us an example that works?
Okay, consider the real-world administrative problem of cleaning up a database. If Team A is simply told clean 5,000 records by the end of the month, that is abstract, mandatory, competence-starving work. But now consider Team B, running a data rescue mission. Each 100 fixed records earns a visible rescue badge, and that's tied to a real-time dashboard that visually tracks how many customer issues they've proactively prevented that week.
The effort is identical, but the internal story changes completely.
Team B is getting measurable, immediate feedback on competence, and their efforts are tied to a purpose: customer welfare, which fulfills that need for relatedness. The work is reframed as a mission of value, not arbitrary data entry. The brain lights up because the game mechanics mirror genuine progress and purpose.
But where does the peril lie? When does gamification become manipulative and counterproductive?
It backfires primarily when the external reward system crowds out the intrinsic motivation. If the focus shifts from, I care about data quality and helping customers, to, I only do this for the points and the badge, you've lost the purpose. And furthermore, public leaderboards, while they satisfy the status drive for the top performers, they often destroy the sense of relatedness among the rest of the team. It turns necessary cooperation into quiet resentment and competition. The framing has to be honest and tied to genuine internal value.
This analysis lets us generate a really practical checklist for better work design. We can move beyond cosmetic gamification and start to fundamentally redesign this invisible architecture of motivation.
We can design game mode work by systematically addressing the brain's fundamental needs. The first critical step is to transform ambiguity into clear, meaningful objectives.
So move away from vague instructions like, be more productive.
Yes. Move away from do better, which provides no metric for competence, to specific measurable goals like reduce customer response time by 10% in the next quarter. The brain needs a clear target to fire at.
And Elena's problem was the lack of rapid feedback. We need to compress that time.
Absolutely. The second requirement is immediate, visible feedback. This means implementing real-time dashboards, easily accessible done today logs, or quick automated checkpoints that visually move when action is taken. This provides that constant competence hit that keeps the motivation loop running.
Third, addressing the risk calculus. Ancestral play worked because it was low risk. Modern work often punishes even small failures.
So we need to design systems for safe experiments and quick retries. Failure has to be actively reframed as valuable data, not a disaster that warrants a reprimand. Creating a safe space to test new ideas and quickly iterate prevents the brain from entering stress response mode and allows that exploratory dopaminergic system to function optimally.
And we have to return that essential hunter-gatherer autonomy, that fierce need for self-direction.
The fourth element is to increase autonomy wherever it's feasible. Individuals have to feel choice and ownership over their methods and, ideally, their projects. The classic example is Google's 20% rule, allowing employees 1 day a week for a cell phone project. Autonomy fuels intrinsic investment.
And finally, relatedness. Bringing back the structure of the cooperative hunting party rather than the anonymous silo.
The fifth principle is to incentivize teams over the individual. Since our ancestors relied so heavily on interdependence, you couldn't hunt large game alone. Modern organizations should reward team achievements over solely individual bonuses. This fosters that essential need for collective success and relatedness.
This sounds like a comprehensive framework, but we have to conclude with the hard reality we acknowledged. No amount of clever psychological redesign is going to fix a fundamentally broken structure.
The sources are unanimous on this point. If the work environment is defined by chronic overload, unfair pay, or a toxic culture, trying to layer game-like design on top of it will be seen as deeply cynical and manipulative.
It has to be built on an honest foundation.
It does. Organizations have to genuinely improve the real working conditions and address the toxic fundamentals before they apply game-like design to make the experience more engaging.
We began this deep dive with Mark, the guy intensely managing the logistics of a virtual space empire on a spreadsheet, after complaining about his identical mandatory job. And we've learned that the distinction between a soul-crushing job and an addictive game is defined by context, architecture, and feedback, not the category of the mental effort itself.
The brain is impartial. It doesn't care if the stakes are real or virtual. It simply measures how well a task delivers on our evolved needs for competence, for status feedback, and for autonomy. Kalo found deep satisfaction in skill acquisition. Eris lost his identity when resource acquisition replaced his craft. And Elena found her dopamine system starving in that modern bureaucratic void.
The ultimate takeaway seems to be this. The deepest human satisfaction, that deep down satisfaction Mark found in his game, is simply the feeling of competence achieved through voluntary, meaningful effort. That feeling is the evolutionary reward we're perpetually seeking.
And whether that reward comes from conquering a virtual empire, mastering a difficult instrument, or solving a critical real-world problem is often determined only by how we choose to design the rules of engagement, and whether we grant ourselves and our colleagues the fundamental dignity of choice and visible progress.